T visas, immigration options for survivors of labor abuses or sex abuse by Helen Tarokic Law, PLLC, Wilmington, North Carolina, www.tarokiclaw.com. Call us at 910-509-7145. This video is property of Helen Tarokic Law, PLLC. The video may not be downloaded or posted anywhere except by Helen Tarokic Law or with written permission of Helen Tarokic Law. This video is intended to be viewed for general informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice for a particular situation. Please consult an attorney to learn more about your immigration options. The intended viewers of this presentation are current clients of Helen Tarokic Law, potential or future clients, or others wanting to learn more about T visas. Hi, Helen.
Hi, good morning, Tara.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you so much. So thanks for being with us today. We're going to go through some information about T visas, and hopefully that will help both our current clients and anyone else who's interested in learning about T visas understand what this great remedy can do. So we'll start with a presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Here we go.
This is
All right,
exciting.
so it is exciting. So officially welcome everyone who's listening. My name is Tayeba Qureshi. I'm one of the associate attorneys here at Helen Tarokic Law. We are an immigration firm based in Wilmington, North Carolina, and we assist clients with a variety of immigration matters across the United States. So today we have with us, of course, our lovely managing attorney, Helen Tarokic. Helen is a North Carolina board certified immigration law specialist, and she leads our very diverse team in this special focus on immigration remedies for victims of labor and sex trafficking, which is called a T visa. And Helen is going to walk us through the T visa today. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you so much. Thank you
All
for
right.
doing this.
Of course. So, Helen, we're going to start very generally with a broad explanation. So, a T visa is called a T Nonimmigrant Visa. And if someone is qualified, it can provide a 4-year permission to live in the United States and a 4-year work permit. And we'll talk about all the other benefits in detail later. But can you just first tell us generally, why should someone learn about their immigration options through a T visa?
So the reason that I got involved in T visa work was truly because this visa option solves problems that other types of immigration applications simply cannot. So, for example, I used to work on a lot of business immigration cases, but I'd find out that bad things would happen. Like the employer who was sponsoring someone made some serious mistakes or even were exploiting the worker. And so then the person was out of status and we couldn't fix it with the business immigration option. And I had lots of business immigration experience, so things would feel really impossible. But then I would find out that when the labor violations were so severe, we could actually apply for a T visa and actually legalize that individual status without sponsorship. Um, a lot of other immigration options don't cover forgiveness or waivers of certain immigration violations, like if somebody has a deportation against their record, or they might have used a US citizen's identity in the past, often out of desperation to be able to work. Those things sometimes can have lifetime or unwaivable bars to immigrating, but the T visa option, if someone is eligible, can fix it. So the reason I got into this type of work was really because there wasn't another option that could cover or protect an individual in the way that T visas can. It's all about trying to find a humanitarian option or a way to fix people's immigration status when really nothing else works.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, we're going to go through some of the specific benefits for T visas, and these start, as you will explain, as soon as the application process begins, not even when the application is filed. So, could you explain why should people do a T non-immigrant visa?
Sure. So I'm actually going to start with the second point on our slide here. The T visa does not require an immigration sponsor. A lot of people for years and years and years over the decades that I've done immigration work are coming to us saying, I have a family member, like a brother who might be able to sponsor me. And I'll say, well, that's maybe possible, but also sometimes those wait times could be 10 or 20 or more years. Or they'll have a sponsor who isn't financially qualified, or maybe the sponsor is not really a nice person. So there are all kinds of issues with sponsors where a person who wants to be independent and just live their life in a normal way in a sponsorship situation, there's a tie or a connection there that's going to change the way that interaction, even if it was a positive one, is. And so with T visas, you are essentially applying for a T visa without a sponsor. You don't need to have a financial sponsor. You are essentially self-sponsoring for the application. So that gives people the freedom to process their case confidentially with immigration without having to rely on family members or employers or someone else to help them legalize their immigration status. And this is America, right? Land of the free. We want people to have that freedom and be independent. So it's a huge reason to do a T visa. Sometimes people choose this even when they have another option to be sponsored by someone, just so they don't have to worry about the sponsorship aspect of it. So another reason to do a T visa is the first one on our slide, that the T visa application process has another form that goes with it. It's called a waiver. This application is a form that is filed along with the T visa application that can request a waiver or forgiveness, or in Spanish, people would say a pardon or a perdón, but it's a way to just simply list out the prior criminal and immigration violations that the applicant has had, and to fully disclose what those violations were, and then request that the T visa application be approved and that those violations be waived. Now, that doesn't mean that those things disappear from a record. It just means that when the T visa is approved, the approval notice is going to note that, for example, if the person had failed to show up to immigration court and had a deportation order against them, that is now waived. Or if the person, like in my earlier example, had used a U.S. citizen identity to work, or had provided, let's say, a birth certificate of a Puerto Rican person and a fake social, and pretended to be a U.S. national or citizen in order to get a driver's license and then present that to work at a company, that kind of false claim to U.S. citizenship can be waived. Another reason to do the T visa process is that criminal violations can be waived. So, for example, there are states where cannabis is legal. Well, right now it's not in the federal rules. And so some people have this on their record or use where that can also be waived if necessary. Or maybe they had a criminal history from the past that might have been the reason they were deported in the first place. They came back unlawfully across the border again, and now they have an immigration and a criminal violation that needs to be waived. So the broad T visa waiver, in public interest and for humanitarian reasons, can forgive these types of violations that sometimes even the most prestigious business or family-based categories cannot waive or forgive. So it's a big reason to do the T if somebody has, what I think clients coming to us often say, if they have like a bad record, that's something we want to look at and say, can we fix this with the T? And another thing I'd mention is that if somebody's ever been in a consultation and the lawyer kind of didn't want to talk about why the criminal charge happened, like shoplifting, for example. It's just kind of like, okay, you've got it on your record, but I don't really want to know if you were guilty or not guilty. Well, in our office, we want to know what happened, because sometimes the criminal charge actually was related to a situation of exploitation. So if
Right.
somebody has convicted for stealing food or baby formula, it might be because they were being victimized and desperate circumstances called for desperate measures. And so that ends up actually, oddly, being a positive factor in their case, that we have now information that explains why a criminal violation took place.
Right. And we often also see people who, because of their victimization, because they are being controlled by someone else, that person controlling them is requiring them to do these other things that are illegal. They get arrested. They're the ones who take the blame instead of the person who has been trafficking them.
Absolutely. Like, why
Yeah.
would somebody go into the Walmart and steal something if they could send someone else in who can take the blame if
Mhm.
someone, if it goes sideways and they get caught? And so
Absolutely.
sometimes we're talking with the people who were the victims of that. Absolutely.
Mm.
So I would just say to people, if you're doing a consultation for a T visa, please make sure that you actually tell the attorney what happened and why, because it can help your case and help the attorney do a better job representing you on this type of
Abs-
application. Yeah.
Absolutely. So tell us about some of the benefits that can start, yeah, earlier, even before you even get your T visa.
So this is something that I could not believe when I first started out with T visas would be possible. Because with almost every other type of immigration option, say for example, if you need Medicaid, which is a type of government health insurance that covers people who are in a lower income bracket, most of the time, if people are undocumented or out of status or otherwise have um, a status that doesn't qualify them for public benefits, then they're going to end up in a situation where they can't have Medicaid until they finally get through the whole immigration process. Well, sometimes it's really hard to pay for or go through an immigration process if you have problems with housing,
Right.
you need mental health assistance but can't pay for it, you have medical issues but are struggling to pay for basic medical care. Sometimes the immigration application is kind of second to that, but without the immigration application, you can't get the benefits. But with T visas, there's a totally different program. There's a program called the Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. And when a person is planning to apply for their T visa, right, they haven't even submitted the application, but they're going to be applying for a T visa. At that point, that's when our firm does a Trafficking Victims Assistance Program referral so that they can start to access some temporary benefits first. And that can be assistance with mental health counseling, housing, grocery cards, gas cards. Um, Other type of assistance can be learning workers' rights, getting to understand more about the healthcare system, having what's called wraparound services or somebody to help them with some social and financial support and who's a professional who can keep things confidential. That's a huge benefit to people who are in the process of planning to apply for a T visa. It also is available for people whose T visas are pending. That means they've been filed and are pending with the government. And that program does provide often some assistance even after the case has been approved to help people adjust to what their new options are going to be. So then once the T visa is approved, then the T visa approved individual can actually access things like, if financially qualified, right? Medicaid, benefits like SNAP or um, people would say food stamps or other public benefits that they need without having to wait many, many years and without having to get a green card. And then one amazing other benefit that's specific to minors, if someone's under 18 and they've been trafficked anywhere in the world, then there's a specific letter that they can get to get those public benefits before they ever apply for immigration status. So there's more than one option to get these benefits. Some are at the planning stages, some are while the case is pending, some are after the case is approved, but there's a humanitarian program designed to support people through the T visa process, as opposed to saying you're going to have to white knuckle your way through your case and get your immigration status, and then maybe you can have access to the things that regular folks in the US have. They're saying, no, in this case, we're going to provide some help to people who are seeking T visas in the beginning and in the middle. And of course, again, at the end, even more options open up.
Wonderful. And lastly, as our overview, will you tell us about what can someone expect after they've gotten their T visa? What are the next steps for them?
So when somebody's approved for a T visa, I usually hear something like, so in a few more years, do we get back in touch about a green card or something like that? And I get to remind our clients that actually, now that your T visa is approved, we should actually start having a conversation about starting your green card. And we don't have to wait to begin that in most of the cases that we have. So when the T visa is approved, we're going to be planning either starting a green card that same year, maybe even that same month, or in some cases, during the 4 years that the T visa status is valid, we might start at the 3-year mark to file for permanent residency, which usually takes a couple of years to go through. So when a T visa holder, I say this a lot to people, when a T visa holder has been finally approved for their T visa status, right? They have climbed the mountain. They have proven all of the immigration requirements. That's the hardest part, is just getting the T visa status. But once you have it, you've climbed that mountain. And then when it comes to residency, we're really just talking about taking a breath and going through one more hill. It's not another giant mountain to climb. They've really already been quite successful. And now it might be a mountain of paperwork, but in terms of the legal qualifications
Right.
for residency, it's really not as complicated. Almost all of the qualifications have already been proven. And
Mhm.
then once a person gets their green card, depending on the way that they've obtained residency, we're usually looking at a 4-year and 9-month wait to apply for American citizenship. Now, some people might have a shorter path. It might be only 2 years and 9 months to apply for citizenship. So I'll give an example for that real quick. If somebody's gotten a T visa because it was their best option, but they're also married to a US citizen and living with them, they might end up doing citizenship on what we call the 3-year rule, which means filing at the 2-year and 9-month mark. So there are some special circumstances where a person might apply for citizenship a little bit sooner, but the bottom line is the T visa has a path to a green card, and people generally complete that green card process during the 4-year time that they have T visa status. If they need extensions of work authorization to finish it, if it took a little longer, that's a normal part of the process. And once they have their green card, those green cards are good for 10 years. But most of our clients are going to work towards American citizenship so that they don't even have to renew that green card. So it's not just some kind of temporary relief, even though the T visa itself is only good for 4 years. It really is opening the door to the big thing, which is residency, and the even bigger thing, which is US citizenship.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that big overview. And now we're going to go into more details. So, another remedy that some people may have heard of is a U visa, which is also called the U Nonimmigrant Visa. And this is a remedy for victims of certain qualifying crimes like domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking. And if the survivors can prove that they were the victim of those specific crimes and they cooperated with law enforcement, which can be something as simple as calling 911 when it happens to you, and they were injured by the crime, even if that's not a physical injury, but it's emotional trauma from having suffered through this crime, they can apply for that U visa. And like a T visa, the applicant can also apply for that waiver that you were discussing for immigration offenses and other offenses. And like the T visa, the U visa also comes with that 4-year permission to stay in the United States, that 4-year work permit, and it also has that path to lawful permanent residency and citizenship. But Helen, why might someone consider filing a T visa instead of a U visa if they're qualified to do that? Or if someone already even has a U visa, why should they consider doing a T visa on top of that?
Such a great question, and such a great explanation of the U visa process too. I think that maybe some people watching this might say, I'm familiar with U visas. Maybe I haven't filed one, but I've heard about someone who's done one. And that's because there are hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who have pending U visas. That law became quite well known. There were lots and lots and lots of different crimes that were on the list that someone might be a victim of, so that then their attorney could file for their U visa status. So it's a little more commonly understood. And so there's a comfort level with it. But because of the hundreds of thousands of people seeking a U visa, and there only being currently 10,000 U visas available to issue to people each year, many people might get their temporary work permit related to a U visa process after a year or two if they sue, or 4 or 5 or 6 years if they or in the regular processing line, but they might wait another 10 years on top of that before they get real U visa status. And then there's more years to wait on top of that for residency. Whereas with T visas, There are 5,000 T visas available every year, but so far less than 5,000 people have applied every year. Now, from what I understand, there are currently more than 5,000 T visas pending, but I think that's combining 2 years worth of applicants. And so if you're watching this video, you know, the statistics are available publicly on how many cases are pending. But the bottom line is that with T visas, they really can be about 10 years faster to getting real T visa status and moving forward with your green card compared to what a U visa can do. And just coincidentally, and preparing for some things at the end of the year, and now, of course, we're filming this video, I was looking back at cases that we had started, whether it was for a U visa originally, and then it turned into a T visa case as we found out more information about our client, or maybe we started a U visa and a T visa process together just to see which one would go through the easiest. And our clients, generally, when I audited our database, our clients from 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, most of them are already either well through the way of a T visa process or approved and moving towards their green card, compared to anybody who had just started a U visa. Now, we do have clients who do both, and there are reasons to do it. So first, a person may have a limited time to get a signature from law enforcement to file for a U visa. And so taking advantage of filing the U visa application kind of gives them something in the hand that feels good and some protection basically while we work on other things like the T visa that could take longer to file. But there's no harm in doing the T visa and the U visa, just as long as we're, you know, careful about the paperwork and make sure that we're consistent in what we're filing for. The T visa, if it comes through first, which it should, because again, far fewer people waiting in line for those T visas. If that T visa is approved, then they'll just close out the U visa case because you won't need it because you'll just move forward with residency based on the T. So if I was going to summarize, why would you do a T visa instead of a U visa? The most important thing is that the T visa process ultimately can get you toward real status, not just deferred action, many, many years faster than a U visa can. Okay. Another reason to do a T visa instead of a U visa would be that there are bigger benefits, like the public benefits and the Trafficking Victims Assistance Program that we talked about. That's not part of the U visa process. So there's more support sometimes for people applying for a T visa compared to a U visa. And then a third reason for filing a T visa would be to share the broader story. You may have a U visa pending already, but adding on the T visa about this other information that happened, by sharing that broader story, you're going to be hopefully switching into a better line and a better option for your future. But you also won't be using a number on the U visa line that somebody else needs. Because of course, there are going to be some people who qualify for a U visa who don't qualify for a T, and they're going to be waiting much longer if their lawyers are keeping them in the U visa line instead of putting them right in another situation. So those are the main reasons that I would say we're usually looking at a T visa instead of a U visa if possible, or adding it on if we can.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So let's just go over quickly some T visa words to know, right? Because lawyers love our terms and we forget that other people don't always know them. So the T1, the T1 applicant is the main survivor of the trafficking. They're going to be the, you know, some people might call it the principal applicant. So they're the ones who experience the trafficking and are the survivors of trafficking. Then there are derivatives who are family members of that T1. And so the T2 is a legally married spouse of the T1. The T3 is an unmarried child under age 21. The T4 is a parent of that initial survivor, the parent of the T1. And T the T5 is the sibling of the T1,
Yes.
which should be T.
Unless it's a T6.
Unless it's a T6,
Unless it's
which
a T6, so
all
that
right.
depends on whether someone's an adult or a minor.
Right,
It gets a little
T5
complicated
or
there.
T6, right? So our listeners heard me stumble a little bit there because it could be both. So a T5 or a T6, depending on the status of that sibling, could be the sibling of that main survivor. And then, of course, this term that anyone who's been familiar with immigration will hear over and over. We call it USIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and that is the immigration agency which confidentially adjudicates or reads and reviews and decides on that T visa application. So other than that T5, T6 issue, Helen, is there anything you want to clarify or include in this conversation?
I think you did better than I would have trying to list out all of those numbers. So there's this sort
No
of
problem.
alphabet of visas, and we get to the, T visa, and then they've got little numbers assigned to each family member and how they're applying. One of the things I would say is if you're watching this and you got excited because you heard about all the T visa benefits, and then you saw the word trafficking and are like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, please do keep watching, because the word trafficking sounds like something it's not.
Yes.
Basically, T visas are going to be for people who suffered through any type of labor or sexual exploitation that fits into an extremely broad definition under a trafficking statute. So if you've been a victim of sexual harassment, or a victim of domestic violence, or a victim of sexual assault, or your employer just paid you late, please stay tuned, because there's a lot of important information. And I could list off 100 more scenarios, but won't right at this moment, about what might fall under trafficking. So
Absolutely.
it's just really important to know that trafficking may be the reason the T visa has the T letter in it. But as far as what these people will be qualified for when we're looking at these terms, it's so much more than what that word seems to imply.
Absolutely. And fortunately and unfortunately, trafficking can occur anywhere. And someone might be a victim of trafficking and not even know. And they can be a victim of multiple kinds of trafficking at the same time. It can happen at home, it can happen at work, it can happen in a community setting, it can happen within a family. And so I would encourage anyone, just like you said, who's listening, to keep listening to learn more exactly about what this means. Thank you. So next up, let's start talking about some of those benefits that we started off in the beginning. So let's talk about, go ahead, however you want to go through this, Helen, let us know. What are the benefits that a T visa holder, even at the application stage, could have?
So I know I've had my coffee, and that makes me very excited in the morning to talk about this stuff, but you could catch me tired on a Friday and I'd still be excited about these benefits. So T visa benefits start with 4 years of status. It's not deferred action, it's not lawful presence. It is actual lawful status, which is much better than deferred action, and it's certainly better than being undocumented or out of status. So that status allows you to be inside the United States for that period of 4 years. The T visa itself is not an international travel permit. Again, it's to be inside the United States. But for example, if someone got one in North Carolina and they wanted to get on a plane to Chicago, they would be able to do that because they have their status and they're traveling within the United States. The other part of the T visa approval that is a plastic work permit with our client's photo on it, their name, their basic information, that work permit is valid for 4 years. If the client has never had a social security number, then they can get one with that work permit. Also, depending on state law, sometimes that 4-year work permit lets people have a bigger benefit within their state. So currently within the state of North Carolina, if you have a 4-year T visa, you should get your full driver's license, which I think is good for 8 years instead of just the 4. So you're getting a little more coverage there is really nice, and that's connected to a state law provision. So the work authorization does not restrict a person to working for their current employer. People who file for T visas could be self-employed. They might decide not to work at all and take a break, or they might be disabled and not be able to work at this time. And so the work authorization card could be used for other things like an identity document. It's the kind of thing that even if a kid is like 3 years old and we're getting them that T3 visa, we're going to want to get them the work permit so that they have that identity document, the social that matches to it. Once a T visa is approved, then again, we're going to want to move forward with adjustment of status, which is also known as applying for lawful permanent residency. And what you get out of adjustment of status is what's famously known in all the movies as a green card. The color of that card has changed throughout the years, but the validity period is 10 years, and those can be renewed typically online every 10 years, unless the person's already gone towards American citizenship. So usually you'll be as a T visa beneficiary with your 4 years of status, starting your green card case in the first year of your process, or in certain cases, it will take 3 years before you're eligible to apply for T status. But overall, our clients who obtain T visa benefits are going to be marching towards getting that green card. And then we also look at derivative family members. Now, some people are just filing on their own for lots of reasons. Sometimes they don't have any supportive family members, and it's a reason why they ended up in a bad situation to begin with. But there are other times when the T visa holder is going to want to include a spouse or children. And in some cases, it will be the adult parents of the T visa holder or the adult or minor siblings of the T visa holder. So the T visa category has broader derivatives, meaning you can sponsor more family members typically than other types of temporary visa categories. So if you've heard things about what U visas can do and how limited they are for sponsoring family, just be aware that the T visa list of who can be included is much longer. And of course, with derivative or family member applicants, there are work authorization benefits as well. Or for example, if a person is in the United States and applying for their T1 visa as the main victim, or we would say survivor, and they have a spouse or children outside of the United States, so the parents or the siblings, we may be filing a petition at the same time that our main client is filing to try to bring in family members from outside the United States. So when they get here, they can then file for the work permit, get their public benefits, and start their green card. And then, of course, one of the huge benefits to the T visa is getting access to the anti-trafficking program resources. This is wraparound services. It's supposed to be like a big bear hug where the community, nonprofits, social workers, all part of confidential programs, but are trying to provide support, whether it's educational, mental health, physical health, well-being, housing, financial assistance, other things that a person's going to need, because oftentimes people who are applying for the T visa have gaps in their lives. Like they may never have had access to basic vaccination healthcare, or they may never have had a dentist appointment, right? And so access to those things, plus in most cases when the T visa is approved, the public benefits part can be really necessary as well to pursue. So lots of T visa benefits.
Wonderful. All right, now that we've heard how wonderful they are and the
Right.
opportunities and benefits, let's get into the details of how can someone actually apply for a T visa. So we'll start with the most basic requirements of the T visa. And when our office is preparing a T visa application for a survivor of human trafficking, what do we have to show?
So the survivor, which under legal terms we'll call the victim or the applicant, must have experienced a severe form of human trafficking. Spoiler alert, I've never seen a form of trafficking that isn't severe. So I'm not really sure why that term is in there. There doesn't have to be even actual trafficking that takes place in these cases. There might be a conspiracy or an attempt to commit trafficking. And again, that word scares people. So I'm going to try to break it down to what it is. It's usually some type of sexual harassment or sexual assault or violation. It may be labor violations in the workplace. It can also be something like in the household. A person who's experiencing domestic violence is made to cook and clean and do all of the household chores excessively, or face some type of verbal or physical abuse. So that kind of servitude within the home is another type of labor violation, even though it's not workplace related. So it could also be religious trafficking, exploitation in the church. That could be things related to what happened on the border. People who are coming across the border are often victimized by the smugglers or agents or coyotes that bring them across. And that may be trafficking as well. There are special rules for minors who are under the age of 18. We'll talk about that in more detail, but the standard to prove a T visa case for a minor generally is a much easier standard to meet compared to people who are trafficked as adults. Although most of the cases we process are for adults, because by the time they get to a law firm, they've already lived their lives. They might be coming to us 20 years after something happened to them, right? It's not something that we usually see the next day after it's happened. So another requirement for a T visa, and again, please don't be too scared when you see these words. We do need, in 99.9% of the cases, to report to law enforcement in order to file. Generally, though, it's not a situation where we're like calling 911, right? So if you're in an emergency and need assistance, you should call 911. When we're going through a legal T visa process, I'm often reporting something that happened a year ago or 10 years ago or 20 or 25 years ago. And so me calling 911 might be a little silly because that's not an emergency, right? That's not an emergency service. So instead, what we would do is we might, through relationships that we have already built over time, report to law enforcement with a letter or an email, just with a little paragraph summary of what had happened and the timeline that these things happened on. And that report oftentimes will be acknowledged, meaning the agency is going to receive it, but they are also going to be aware that we're simply fulfilling our obligation as attorneys to have reported to some type of law enforcement agency that this labor or sex abuse took place in the past in order for us to then move forward with filing for the T. So I tend to look at these law enforcement reports for the applications we're filing as an administrative step. Now, for situations where a person is currently in danger, or there are other people currently being trafficked, we have what I would call a hot case where things are on fire. Those are situations where there may be more of an investigation. Law enforcement may receive the report and say, this is something we need to look into, especially if other people are in danger. But when we're looking at older and colder cases where a lot of time has passed or nothing was ever previously reported, I usually don't expect an investigation or even a phone call to happen if we've done the report. So reporting to law enforcement also has a trauma exception for people who are too traumatized to report what happened because it was so horrible and they're just too scared to deal with it in any way at all. There is an exception related to reporting, but most of the time we're able to complete a report in a very careful and protective way so that our client feels comfortable knowing that we've chosen the best agency to report to and that we've also aligned ourselves with the goals for the case, right? Are we looking for criminal justice? Are we looking for financial justice? Or are we essentially looking for social justice, which would be the ability to legalize immigration status based on having been a victim or survivor of sex or labor abuses? Now, with the U visa, I'm sure most of you have already heard, you can't apply for one if law enforcement hasn't signed off. But with T visas, yes, there's a certification form, but no, you don't need law enforcement to sign off. You don't even need law enforcement to understand what trafficking is. So it's a relatively new concept, and I'm sure Taba can vouch for this. We've certainly reported trafficking to law enforcement agencies in the past who haven't had training on the very broad definition of trafficking, or they're like, this is way past the statute of limitations. There's nothing we can do with this. Like, thanks for telling us, but there's really nothing we can do here. Excuse me. So you don't have to have law enforcement creating a formal incident report. They also don't have to sign a T visa certification to file for the T.
Mm-hmm.
So, excuse me.
No problem. It's okay. Take a break and get a sip of water. No worries. So yeah, so that certification that the U visa requires is often sometimes a hurdle for people who are trying to apply for a U visa, right? They're stuck without being able to apply for the remedy if law enforcement, for any reason, won't sign the certification, right? Like you said, sometimes there's not enough training, even for U visas, right? Let's not even talk about Ts, but even for Us, sometimes law enforcement don't recognize and don't have enough training or support to understand what that certification form means. Sometimes they have internal policies that won't have them sign the certification if it's the crime was more than a few years away, right? So if it's 5 years or 10 years away from the moment they're being presented that certification, they might not sign it. But that is not a requirement for the T visa. You don't need that certification signature.
So that's been a huge relief, I think, for our clients, knowing that they're often not going to be in a situation where they have to sit in a police officer's office or where they have to go through a difficult investigative process. It's not to say that an offer of cooperation is not provided, but we only do have to show that someone who's reasonable in a similar situation, like in our client's shoes, is only complying with reasonable requests for assistance by law enforcement. And I think that that's an extremely low standard where just offering the information that if they were interested, they could have that conversation is enough to be a reasonable cooperation, even if there's never a phone call or other follow-up related to it. Now, I will say we've really had some amazing experience with task forces, law enforcement officers, or prosecutors who are well aware of how pervasive this type of labor and sex abuse is in the community. And they have really gotten it. Like, not only did they recognize that maybe this took place too long ago, so there's nothing that they can do to move forward with an investigation or prosecution, but they still have certified our clients knowing that they had tried to at least report or let them detect these patterns. So for an example, I've had a conversation with an FBI agent before who said, again, there's really nothing we can do on this one, but to our client, tell me your story anyway, because
Mm,
maybe I will hear how the coyote smugglers are doing this type of criminal activity. And then the next time I hear about it happening to someone more recently, I'll know about this pattern, right? So they're trying to learn and they're also allowing that story to be told.
mhm,
There are other times when FBI has said, just thank you so much for this message. We appreciate it. And then there's really not much more follow-up that needs to happen there as well.
mm,
And sometimes we get referrals from law enforcement. So officers know something weird has happened and it's not fitting into any boxes. And they're just like, can you just look at this one and let me know what this is? And we'll say, okay, now let's go ahead and spend the time to figure it out in a little bit different way. And then if we can provide more information, we will, as long as our client wants us to.
mhm.
So
And
if
you
you're afraid, oh,
also,
sorry.
I'm sorry, you also offer Eventbrite trainings on Eventbrite for throughout the year about different aspects of T visas. And our law enforcement partners are always welcome to come and attend and learn about what is trafficking, what are some common fact patterns that people from across the country see for their clients. And we've even had some former FBI agents, former police officers train our listeners, people who want to take those trainings and our staff internally about things that they have seen, in their previous career about what kind of trafficking happens in the country, across the country.
That's been an amazing way to share information as well and to try to stop trafficking from happening, or at least help people who have been victims all across the United States. So that's right. My law firm, Helen Tarokic Law PLC, is accredited to provide continuing legal education. So we teach classes to other attorneys, or we invite attorneys or law enforcement or former law enforcement to teach classes as well, so that attorneys and other professionals can understand better what is the T visa, talk about trafficking screening, how to identify if someone's been a victim. And when law enforcement has joined us on those seminars and has asked questions or provided information, it's been amazing. And I do remember one specific time when we were in a training and an attorney was saying, here's the trafficking situation I have, but I'm not really sure or familiar with law enforcement in this specific area where that client was a victim. And amazingly, there was a law enforcement officer on that training who said, I know exactly who you need to talk to. And they connected offline, privately later on. So that kind of magic just in the community of people trying to stop trafficking has been really impressive. But again, back to, where our clients are at with this,
Mhm.
Most of them don't want to have anything to do with law enforcement, and I get it,
Sure.
but the law is designed, again, there's a trauma exception, extremely limited, and then to reporting, and then also the law is designed to allow people to report to any agency that's acceptable. It doesn't have to be the one that's necessarily the scariest. And so I think that that helps people a lot. And we've generally seen a lot of professionalism with different agencies related to law enforcement.
Absolutely. So we talked about the concept of the severe form of human trafficking as a requirement for the T visa. We talked about reporting and cooperating with law enforcement. Now tell us about the next requirement for applying for a T visa, which is that you have to be physically present. The primary applicant, the T1, has to be physically present in the United States on account of or because of trafficking. So unpack that for us a little bit. What does that mean?
It definitely needs some unpacking. It's one of those things where the law says something, but it's not exactly saying what it says, which is why I suppose lawyers get involved and we have entire legal teams to work on this. So it doesn't mean that you have to have been brought into the United States by traffickers across the border. We have lots of cases where smugglers did traffic people across they did traffic people while they were smuggling them across the border, or after they smuggled them into the US, they put them in a stash house, made them cook and clean, or forced them to have sex. And so when we're talking to clients about how are you here on account of trafficking, yes, sometimes it does involve crossing the border, but it does not require, under the T visa law, that you were brought in related to the trafficking. So sometimes a person could have come here, 10, 20 years ago, and the trafficking might have happened 5 years ago. And I'll give an example of that. Let's say someone, I'll use my hot air balloon example. They came to the United States in a hot air balloon, right? Doesn't matter how they got here. They magically appeared. They were teleported into the United States. However they got here, doesn't matter. But now they're working at a dry cleaner. And at the dry cleaner, they are paying them late. The checks are bouncing, and they're threatening them with deportation if they don't show up to work the next day. That's labor trafficking. That person is here on account of trafficking, even though it had nothing to do with how they got into the United States, right? The person driving the hot air balloon didn't do anything mean to them, but years later, they experienced what's called domestic trafficking. And so they are here on account of trafficking. Another thing that people ask about physical presence on account of trafficking is, but how is this still related to someone being here if they were victimized 20 years ago? And I would just ask people in response to that to think about childhood grievances. There are people who've hurt us when we're very young, and we never forget those things because they were very impactful and traumatic at our age, and they stayed in our minds all these years. And trafficking is so much more severe than what we might see on the playground or something, that didn't happen right in class in the 5th grade. So when someone's experienced trafficking, that hurt or that pain, it may be covered up, it may have mellowed over time in some ways, or it may be just as strong like it was yesterday. So when we apply for T visas, the physical presence requirements that lawyers are explaining on the T visa application will relate to whether the applicant needs mental health assistance since the time that they were trafficked, even if it was many years ago, or we'll explain this was only recently reported, or maybe just a month ago, the person found out that they were a victim of trafficking. They may have thought they were just a victim of wage and hour violations. And now they're going, oh, well, now that you've explained this to me, yes, all of those things did happen. I just didn't realize at the time that that's what this was. And so just even being recently identified as a survivor of trafficking can meet that requirement. But just again, to repeat, you don't have to have been drug across the border to be trafficked. Many, many, many of our clients were trafficked many years after coming to the United States.
Absolutely. And let's talk about the last requirement that the applicant should show, that if they were removed from the United States or they had to go back home, essentially go back to their country of origin, that that would cause them extreme hardship involving unusual and severe harm. So first of all, what does that even mean? And secondly, how can we show that for someone who is a victim of trafficking who's applying for a T visa?
So if I could have things my way, I would just say the regulation should be there's a presumption that anybody who has been trafficked would suffer this type of hardship, right? It should be just a normal part of what we would expect for anybody who's been through this. But we do need to document for immigration that the person would suffer in some way if they were not allowed to remain in the US. But it's not physical suffering necessarily. Most of the time, we're saying things like, well, if the person weren't allowed to stay in the United States, they might not have access to justice. Or if they weren't allowed to remain in the US, they would lose their family ties and they have sick kids who need to be taken care of. And that would hurt them as parents, right? Or we'll argue that the person needs to have mental health counseling. Please don't be scared of mental health counseling. It can be extremely helpful for your well-being. And most of our clients, although they might be a little bit uncomfortable with starting therapy as a part of their case plan, come back to us later and say, my goodness, this helped me realize so many different things in my life and was so helpful to me, far beyond anything that it meant for the immigration case. So the mental health aspect and being able to get that type of specialized mental health care in the United States by providers who actually understand how our labor laws work and all of that has made a huge difference. And so if somebody was to be sent back to their country, they wouldn't have access to that anymore. So we make that argument. There are lots of different boxes we can check related to the type of hardship someone might experience if they weren't allowed to stay. And I think that as long as we methodically explain that in the application, it's really not that hard to show a hardship for getting T visa status. I feel like that's the requirement that you can only mess up if you're not paying attention as a lawyer. But if you actually just work the checklist and make sure that you cover all of these questions with your client and listen to your client, what they actually have to say, you'll hear all of the things that almost every survivor experiences that will fit into the boxes that immigration created, which is kind of nice too. It shows that immigration created a very long and broad checklist for people to show hardship to make it not so hard for people to meet the unusual and severe harm aspect of the case.
Absolutely. All right, so let's give an overview. We've said the word human trafficking many times, and we know that the T visa is a remedy for victims, survivors of human trafficking, either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. But that word trafficking might be completely unfamiliar for some of our listeners, or you might have a very limited understanding of what that means based on something you've seen on TV, a movie, or a show. So I'll give a very general explanation, then turn it over to you in terms of what trafficking means. And so we asked this question to the survivor, to the victim. Has anyone ever forced you to do something that you didn't want to do? Has anyone ever made you do something that you didn't want to do by lying to you, tricking you, kind of making the circumstances feel like you had to do something or something bad would happen to you? And this could be at work, in a relationship, where you live, where your community is. And if the answer is yes, you might want to explore your immigration options through a T visa. So Helen, will you explain a little more in detail what trafficking is?
I think you've done a great job explaining the basics there. I do think that our clients, or potential clients, when we're screening them, often will say things like, no, I was never threatened. Nobody ever forced me to do anything at this job. But then as we ask more questions, like, have you ever been paid late? The answer might be yes. Okay, so why were you paid late? Well, they would tell me that they didn't have any money because the main boss man hadn't paid the bills, so they couldn't pay the workers till later. But they promised they were going to pay you, right? Yes. So you were supposed to be paid on time. They told you they would pay you on time, but now they've made an excuse why they couldn't pay you on time. Yes. So did the boss ever talk about fancy vacations, drive an amazing fancy car, flash cash at you, take time off, Or were they working shoulder to shoulder with you every moment? Did they pay themselves instead of paying you? Those kinds of questions. Then we go, oh, well, now that we think about it, maybe actually, yeah, he had a $70,000 truck and he would always talk about his vacations and what they were going to do on the weekend and would come and check on us for a while and might yell at somebody, but then, come back again an hour or two later or at the end of the day. So we see then that it seemed like it was the truth at the time, but maybe it was false promises to pay someone and fraud that really tricked these people into working for no pay, little pay, late pay. And that would be labor trafficking. That would be using fraud, sometimes coercion, to get someone to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. Now, that's a workplace example, so we'd call that involuntary servitude. And sometimes, debts are created in that way too, where the boss only pays a portion of what they're supposed to. And then our client has ended up having to pay other coworkers because they feel bad for them. And then they've left with nothing. And now there's this big debt that they have to work off, that kind of thing. In the sex trafficking cases, those are often coming down to definitions. So for example, if somebody is in a domestic violence relationship where they are expected to have sex whenever their intimate partner wants them to, regardless of whether they're feeling well, regardless of what time it is, of day, those sorts of things. And they're being told, like, you're from this country, whatever country they're from, and that's how a person is supposed to have sex when I want it and now. That could be sexual slavery or servitude that would be a domestic violence-based T visa case in simple terms. Another example of commercial sex trafficking could be something like forced prostitution, someone being threatened to have sex with other people, and then there is a thing of value like money being exchanged or food or water or drugs or alcohol. In some cases, a commercial sex trafficking case has nothing to do with having sex with multiple partners. It may be something like a person telling another, I'm going to kill you if you don't perform this act. I know this is really dark stuff, and I'm sorry to have to talk about it, but I hear that that threat happens frequently. So in a situation like that, if there is a threat of someone's life, the opposite of that is offering them safety, right? I'm offering you something of value, which is your life, in order for you to put up with a sex act you don't want to consent to or can't consent to if you're a minor. That would also fit the definition of commercial sex trafficking.
So, Helen, thanks for that overview of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and we saw that there was a little bit of a special rule for people who are minors under 18 who are victims of sex trafficking, and we will talk more about that later in the video. But can you talk to us about one of the very common patterns of human trafficking that we see, which is smuggling turned trafficking, right? And again, this is just one way that someone can be a victim of human trafficking. It's not required that the trafficking happened to bring them into the United States, that it happened as they were crossing the border. It's definitely possible, as you explained, to apply for a T visa after you've been in the United States for many years. You came on perhaps some kind of work visa or a business visa or some other kind of status, or even if you entered without status, but the trafficking happened later, that's definitely something that can happen. But one of the scenarios that is maybe most common for people to understand is someone is being trafficked as they are coming across the border into the United States. Can you tell us about smuggling and trafficking, please?
Sure. So the slide that we have here comes from the Administration for Children and Families, and it's a little hard to see on there, but it's actually coming from that part of that office's office in trafficking in person. So there's actually a government agency that helps people who are victims of trafficking understand what is the difference between trafficking and smuggling, and this is where that slide comes from. So smuggling is a crime against a country, or sometimes it's a civil violation. And what it means is basically taking something or someone across a border. So oftentimes we were looking at something like smuggling in, say, some snacks that your auntie gave you and wants you to bring into the United States because they're the most delicious homemade snacks, but they don't quite necessarily meet our customs rules for what you can bring into. Usually they want stuff in a package or a can. And so maybe somebody keeps that in their purse and they're coming through the border and kind of keeping that secret, right? Or with humans, it may be something like parent is trying to bring in a child across the border without them being seen in the car. Maybe the parent has permanent residency, but the child doesn't have immigration status. And so they're just covering them up with a blanket and trying to get them across. And that smuggling is designed to bring someone into the United States in this scenario, but it's not trying to harm physically a person. It's not trying to get money out of them in either one of those scenarios, although sometimes there is a monetary transaction. So it could also be a situation where a smuggler or an agent or people who are known as coyotes are charging somebody money to help hide them in a truck or to help them walk across the board without being detected by immigration. With smuggling, this is usually a mutually beneficial transaction in the eyes of both parties, meaning the child wants to come to the United States. The smuggler wants to receive money and is getting paid for this to happen. And in some contexts, this could be life-saving, like people who are fleeing extreme violence are being brought in, sometimes for a price, to the United States and then allowed to move on and go to whichever family member they wanted to connect with, seek refuge, maybe apply for asylum or some other immigration benefit. So this is about crossing borders, some type of transnational physical movement of a person or property. Trafficking is actually a crime against a human being. So human trafficking is never going to be nice to the person who's being trafficked. Either the person can't consent to what's happening, or if they did agree, let's say, to be brought across the border, they're then being made to somehow cook or clean or have sex or do some type of service or performance or act that they originally did not agree to do, or in cases sometimes people aren't even able to agree to do it, right? So excuse me, so human trafficking is about exploiting the victim, whereas smuggling is usually a business arrangement, like paying a certain amount to get across the border, or it can be a non-paid situation, just helping someone get across the border into safety, essentially. But it is with smuggling, when you're not coming in with permission, either a civil or criminal violation. So it is against the law, right? With trafficking, it doesn't have to involve crossing a border. Now, it might, you could have a situation where someone agreed to pay $1,500 to be crossed into the United States across the Rio Grande, the river. And so the smuggler takes their money and then puts them in a safe house, brings them across the river at a time when immigration officials aren't there to catch them, and then puts them into another safe house. That means the smuggling's been accomplished. But then at that point, now they're not going to let them leave. Instead, they're going to make them have sex for money with other people, or they're going to attack them and sexually assault them and tell them if they don't hold still or something horrible like that, that they're going to lose their life. And it could be a situation of lying to the person. It may not involve sex. It could just be saying something like, you know, we made it to Texas, but to get you now to Arizona or to get you to Milwaukee, it's just not safe enough to move you yet. So you're going to need to stay here for a little while. And while they have them in this, you know, abandoned house or warehouse or whatever, that's when they start having them cook and clean, clean bathrooms, move boxes, help in some way to sort of earn their keep, even though it wasn't something that they wanted, even though they didn't agree to perform labor. And on top of that, sometimes we'll see extortion where they're saying, now I want more than the $1,500 that you paid. Now I want $5,000 and you're not going to be released until you're paid in full. And then while they're extorting someone, they're saying, and also you're going to cook and clean and do all these other labor activities while you're basically being held here against your will. And so that forced labor concept or coerced labor or fraud that was used to get somebody to work ends up facilitating a smuggling operation by essentially making them cheap or unpaid labor. So if it weren't human trafficking and they weren't forcing people to cook or clean, what would happen is in that situation, we would see that the smugglers would have to do that work, right? But if you're forcing people to do it, they're not.
So, yes, and I want to highlight a couple of specific things that you said and that I often see with our clients. And you actually wrote an article for Ayla this year. We're filming this in 2023 in December. So you wrote an article with another partner attorney this year about smuggling turned trafficking and how a person for many different reasons, might agree with an agent to pay them a certain amount of money and have themselves brought into the United States, right? So it's purely a business agreement. I agreed for you to bring me here. I did not agree to do all these other terrible things. I did not agree for you to take advantage of me and force me to work or force me to have sex. I did not agree for all of this stuff. And so that's when it changes from something that's just smuggling, like you said, a crime against a country, to becoming a victimization situation, a crime against a person, right? And another thing that we see is that many times when our clients agree with an agent to come into the United States, they don't even know what they're agreeing to. They're just trying to escape a difficult situation. And they just, once they agree with this agent, they kind of lose control over their life and what happens to them. So as they get passed from agent to agent or hand to hand in order to come into the United States, they go through a lot of trauma, they go through a lot of victimization. It's still relevant to the story, even though it's not happening in the United States, but it's still relevant to their story because it's part of the trauma they're experiencing. And also, once they get into the United States, sometimes instead of being a free person when they enter, like the trafficker or the smuggler promised them, they just get handed off to someone that the agent knows in America and end up being a victim of forced labor or commercial sex. And so, it kind of turns into something that they didn't consent to. No one told me that this is how it was going to be.
One of the things that we see sometimes in older cases reviewed by immigration is that they unfortunately incorrectly blamed the victim. So they would put in a letter to the immigration attorney that the client knowingly undertook the dangerous journey to the United States and could expect some forced labor in order to avoid being detected by immigration. And if we saw something like that, we of course responded to it again with reminding them that the Administration for Children and Families, Office on Trafficking Persons, and many other offices and federal law do not blame the victim. Yes, they may have engaged in a transaction that was unlawful or agreed to be smuggled into the United States, but what they didn't agree to was forced labor or forced commercial sex. And so those cases should be approved. If you were in a situation where a case like that was filed for you and it wasn't approved, I would suggest getting legal advice about whether you have an option to appeal or sue the government. There were some times we had to sue to explain to the government the difference between trafficking and smuggling. Also, you don't have to have been trafficked inside the United States to file for a T visa. So we have people who got here, it has nothing to do with smuggling. They were never brought in unlawfully to the United States. Maybe they came on a valid visa and then things went sideways from there. And those people do apply for T visas as well. But our point in trying to make folks understand the difference between trafficking and smuggling is that the T visa is not designed to just be provided to someone who crossed the border unlawfully. It's about providing it to someone who has been a victim. A crime has been committed against them, not just the border. And again, that comes down to labor violations or violations related to sex or attempt or conspiracy to make that happen. A couple of interesting things that had happened in cases like this that we've been successful on. Sometimes the smuggling happens to everybody, But the trafficking, like the forced labor, happened to maybe one or two people in a group of children or adults. And our argument was by explaining what happened to the others, that ultimately the trafficking operation depended on a conspiracy or a plan or a scheme to have this type of forced labor sex happen to every person in the group. Maybe law enforcement got involved and freed everybody before it happened to everyone, or the next truck came and moved the adults or children out to the next stash house before it happened to everybody. But if you're a victim of attempted or conspiracy to traffic, that will also create generally T visa eligibility. And Taba, what you said about how sometimes the trafficking is actually happening outside of the United States, and then persons are passed from one to another and then kind of dumped into the river or abandoned in the desert or pushed across the border, or crossed even to another colleague, hard to call them that, but another like coworker in the smuggling or trafficking operation. Those cases are ones I would call a choo-choo train, where the person might have been trafficked in Mexico or in Canada and then passed off to other people to cross over. But at that point, they didn't know really where they were. They didn't have a method of escape. Horrible things had happened to them. There was really no freedom of movement or agency for them. I mean, they didn't have a control over their situation. And so for those people, those often are also trafficking cases. So if someone was trafficked outside of the United States and then ended up being brought in, that may rise to the level of a T visa case. But again, those are ones where a lot of lawyer analysis, I think, has to happen to make sure that every requirement for the T visa is met. I would just say to anybody watching this, don't rule yourself out until you get complete and full analysis of your case to determine T visa eligibility, because this stuff can get confusing. That's why we have charts trying to explain the difference between trafficking and smuggling, and why there's a very long policy manual that immigration published that's supposed to help explain to people deciding these cases and to people filing these cases how the T visa works.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And in our next episode, in our next bit of video recording, we're going to talk much more in detail about how we as attorneys think about labor trafficking and sex trafficking, really tied to the law on all of these issues. So thank you so much for this overview. And next up,
Thank you.
we'll move into more of the legal argument, which is what we love to talk about.
Thanks
And
so much.
thanks to everyone who's listening.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
Bye. T visas, immigration options for survivors of labor abuses or sex abuse, by Helen Tarokic Law, PLLC, Wilmington, North Carolina, www.tarokiclaw.com. Call us at 910-509-7145. This video is property of Helen Tarokic Law, PLLC. The video may not be downloaded or posted anywhere except by Helen Tarokic Law or with written permission of Helen Tarokic Law. This video is intended to be viewed for general informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice for a particular situation. Please consult an attorney to learn more about your immigration options. The intended viewers of this presentation are current clients of Helen Tarokic Law, potential or future clients, or others wanting to learn more about T visas.